Tim, thank you very much indeed for accepting this opportunity to be on a podcast. And I'm really excited to meet and chat because you have prompted a thought in me that just wasn't there before. And I'm somebody who's curious and interested in all sorts of things. So when somebody comes up with an observation that I hadn't even considered before, it absolutely gets my attention. And we're going to come into that in a couple of moments' time. But I want to paint some context first. You're formerly from Jersey, you find yourself in Singapore. That's a hell of a journey. I mean, not just a hell of a journey in terms of flight and time zones. We're obviously speaking in the evening for you, but actually culturally, and the world has changed quite a bit since you
Mhm.
were in Jersey. And so you have this interesting combination of your location has changed, the culture is different, the language is different, something we'll explore a little later, and time has moved on. And I imagine to a certain extent, time and pace are very different where you are to where I am, and yet we're all part of the global economy. So I'm quite interested in your journey, both theoretical and practical.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you. I think we connected. I suspect we first connected around TEDx,
Hmm.
which was a lot of years ago, back in Jersey. When I was last living in Jersey, I mean, Jersey's my home, is where I was born. But when I was last living in Jersey, I was working in various ways to try and help the island at that point with its explorations around building relationships with China, particularly in the finance industry. And that led me into working with some of the schools. We worked on some language programs for some businesses, a couple of trust companies, a couple of banks, as well as actually, more traditional evening classes and as well as after school classes. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff going on, trying to help the island build bridges with China so very far away. From Jersey, through many of the clients that I was working with, was continually encouraged to spend some time in London because so many of these companies that I was working with, the decisions very often were being made in London around sort of global strategy.
Mhm.
So we moved to London, and whilst I was in London, I was doing some work for London School of Economics,
Oh,
again around helping through what was then the Department of Trade and Industry. I don't know what it is now. Helping businesses, British businesses, do business with China, and the LSE had a program and they invited me to contribute to that. Through that, I was introduced to a number of schools, and as well as the businesses and government departments. And that's how I was connected with a group of international schools in China. Um, it's under the Dulwich brand. Dulwich is an old public school in South London. But they have the international brand has a number of international schools in China, although the company itself is headquartered in Singapore. So the reason I'm in Singapore is I was invited through a process to come and work with this particular group of international schools from their headquarters on challenges that they were facing with teaching Chinese to people from all sorts of different backgrounds, but who were in English medium schools. And there are a number of different challenges, but those particular ones, the first one was we have kids from all sorts of different backgrounds and all different stages of learning of Chinese. Some kids that were born in China, some kids that have turned up in China age 13 with no Chinese, and they're all in a year 8 class. And we're supposed to teach them Chinese because it's part of the curriculum, but they are at such wildly different stages of their Chinese language learning journey, What do we do with that? And so that was the first challenge we were trying to address. The second challenge we were trying to address was we now have across all of the different schools something like 200 different teachers of Chinese, and yet we have one brand that we are trying to build and develop. In reality, your experience of learning Chinese is very much dependent on which teacher you get. And that's a problem if you are trying to build consistency in certain brand messages. So what can we do about that? And then the third thing really came more from the parents, which was, my kid has been learning Chinese at school and they're getting good results in their tests and all the rest of it. But when they step out of the school, and they actually meet a Chinese person, or if they're at a school in China, get into a taxi or whatever else, they can't open their mouths, or they don't want to open their mouths. They just look down at their feet and they feel embarrassed and uncomfortable.
Tim, I'm really interested in what you were saying about the challenges of having a brand, having consistency, having standards, when actually all your students come from different backgrounds, have different abilities, and of course, all your tutors will have their own idiosyncratic, different ways of doing things. And of course, one's lived experience is with the person you're dealing with, but of course, the organization wants real consistency. And actually, what you describe is an interesting challenge, and I'm really interested in how you have addressed that. But in part because actually it's not unique. You could take that scenario and change it for any profession has similar challenges. So what approach have you taken?
That's an excellent question. I think the answer to that is trying to embrace a wider range of tools. We have a horrible habit of trying to be too black and white, too all or nothing. So it's technology versus the teacher in an educational context. And it's one of the reasons, because education is such a human thing. Education is about shaping humans. The education sector is notoriously behind the curve compared to other sectors. And I think it's for that reason. There is this sense that we can't have machines shaping humans. I think that's the instinctive sense that we have, and there's surely something in that. Of course, we, quite blithely continue to allow machines to shape humans in all sorts of other ways, and don't really wrestle with the issue perhaps a little bit more deeply. So I think that in terms of looking at the general condition, I think it's about using all of the tools that are available to you. So it's not about lecturer or teacher or human face-to-face meeting, depending on your context, versus technology, apps, Zoom, whatever else it is. It's about looking at the various tools that you have and trying to embrace both. So what machines obviously are extremely good at is anything mechanical, anything that can be process-driven, logic-driven, pattern-driven. Machines are far quicker than human beings are at those kinds of things, and they don't get bored either. So that's marvelous. And so anything that is mechanical, so if we bring it back to language teaching, for example, you think about your typical language teacher is somebody that is highly educated. They have a university degree. They've then gone on to do some kind of teaching qualification. They've probably got several years of experience. You're dealing with somebody with 25 years of educational background and expertise, at least, standing in front of a group of children and behaving like a robot, drilling vocabulary, 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 vocabulary. It's mind-numbing for the teacher. It's mind-numbing for the kids. Why are we doing that? Give that job to a computer. So I think that also then allows for us to deliver a much more personalized experience. If in the example that you kindly picked up on and highlighted, if you've got kids coming into a Chinese language program from lots of different backgrounds at lots of different stages, you need a machine to manage that. A human cannot manage that many different levels of need effectively and address them effectively. That's just not humanly possible. So let the machine do it. Let the machine work out where the gaps in the knowledge are. Let the student acquire the missing vocabulary from the machine. The machine can give them feedback on their pronunciation, on their handwriting. It can do all sorts of things. And then what the teacher's job is to give them a reason to actually bother. So the teacher gives them a reason to bother, first of all, by imparting that 25 years of experience. Why do you love this language? Why have you decided to try and help other people to learn this language? Presumably because you love it. Well, let's give free rein to that. Let that passion and excitement inspire the students. And they've actually got a reason to use the machine that is there to help them to acquire the knowledge. But nobody learns a language just because they want to be able to say, oh, I know 100 words, 500 words, 1,000 words. So what? They do it because they want to be able to do something with it. Well, that's also the teacher's job. Show me how this is going to make a difference in my life. Give me an opportunity to use what I have learned in order that I grow in some way as a human being. Well, a teacher cannot effectively do that without some really good data. The machine gives the teacher that kind of data so that when you come into my classroom, my iPad tells me exactly what you have recently been learning and recently been practicing. So my job as a teacher is not to teach you stuff that you don't know, but to give you an opportunity and an excuse to show off and practice using what you do know, so that you don't forget it and so that you continue to build on it. So that human working at a higher order of magnitude and the machine delivering a greater level of personalization, adaptation to the individual needs, relieving of the human beings of the dehumanizing mechanical tasks. It's that combination of the two that are key. And at that point, of course, for a brand, again, like you say, whether it's an educational brand or some other kind of brand, it doesn't matter. The machine provides some level of brand consistency. I mean, if you're a hotel group, you can say very accurately, all of my staff are competent at saying these particular things. I know that because I have data to show it. And I even have recordings of them, which I didn't have to process manually. The machine did all of that for me. So I can say that with confidence. But I can also say, but you have to meet Anita. She's hilarious about such and such, and she loves to do this, that, and the other. And then you must, come over here and meet Jeremy because, he's got this real thing going. So you're actually freeing the human beings to shine whilst you ensure that the base level common understanding is well covered and well evidenced and well managed. So that's of course, anybody that's interested, I can talk till the cows come home about the specific program that we did for Chinese in a particular set of language of international schools. But that's essentially been our approach. So it's to take the learning of the language, the basic acquisition of the language away from the teacher and put it into the hands of every individual student using technology. And then that transforms the interactions that the humans have with each other in the classroom.
I'm interested in that. I mean, two thoughts spring to mind. I very much like what you were saying, the technical ability of the language and the desire. And I know for my part, and I suspect it is for many people, the first words that you wear are the swear words, the rude words, the words, bit of slang or whatever, or the sort of the key messages in a bar, because those are this is what I want to do. And then that richer, fuller vocabulary is what I ought to do. And one will naturally lead to the other. So I very much like the idea of this blended approach that says use the tutor to stimulate the want, the desire, and use the technology to provide the vocabulary and the ability. But if we compare that, for example, and this is perhaps oversimplistic, but I think it's relevant and it's interesting to explore. When I was young, we did our multiple tables, okay, and it was only much later that everyone said, look, the calculators are here. We'll all use calculators. And increasingly, people probably don't do the multiplication tables. They recognize and endorse calculators. And the thing here is we're trying to solve mathematical problems. It doesn't matter the fact that you have a tool. Now, there's a bit of a backlash here because there are some people saying you really still need those fundamentals, even if the calculator is solving it for you. And I've certainly had people come to me and say, I need Excel to do percentages. How do I do percentages? And I say, well, how would you do it if you were doing with a pen and paper? And they go, I don't know. Well, if you don't know how to do it with a pen and paper, explaining how to do it with Excel is still going to be difficult. It's not a magician. Now,
Absolutely.
all of this relates to AI.
Yeah.
Because actually, is AI the calculator, which is a useful tool? Does it risk de-skilling us because now we don't even do our multiple tables? AI is going to do it all for us. Does it re-skill us because we're going to do much more interesting things with this skill set available to us? And to what extent is it a really force for good or against? How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the jury is still out. And it is up to us as the general population. It is not up to Google or OpenAI or Microsoft or whoever else to decide the answer to that question. It's up to us.
Mhm.
And the trouble is, it seems to me that there is not enough conversation and not enough discussion amongst us outside of the tech giants around what do we want AI to do? What do we want our relationship with AI to be? If we have AI as a tool, what do we want to delegate to it? And if we delegate those things to it, what do we do? And it really comes down to a question of what does it mean to be human? And what opportunities do we have now that we have these additional tools that we did not have before? What opportunities do we have to become more fully human, more flourishing and thriving as human beings? That is not a question that Google is wrestling with. That is not a question that OpenAI cares about, at least at a really deep level, because they are too driven by the kind of space race to get the next model and the next tool ready and out to the public in order to keep up with the battle that's going on between the tech giants. So I think if we there is a connection here with language. So if we make this connection, I think that what the illustration you just gave with percentages is really good, is that there is a logic that needs to be understood. I mean, why are we interested in percentages anyway? What does percentage mean? Why do you want a percentage? Do you need that? Are you doing it just because your boss asked you for a percentage and now you've got to try and work out how to deliver it? Or is there actually value in having a percentage? If we have AI tools that produce, I don't know, pie charts from the same data, do we still need the percentage? Or does that belong to a bygone era? Do you see what I mean? Is this kind of thing? That fundamentally comes down to how we make sense of our environment, of the world in which we live, the context in which we live at a macro level on this planet and in the global ecosystem, and then, within a global marketplace, and then within a nation, and then within a particular community, and then within a particular business within that community, and so on. These are the questions that we have to wrestle with. How do we make sense of our surroundings? How do we navigate? How do we look after the people, ourselves and the other people around us in our particular context without harming the people on whom our community is dependent? These kinds of questions. You have to think through that. You have to work through that. And you have to take inspiration from what previous generations have done and the answers that have stood the test of time and the different systems that they came up with. And you have to, in some sense, be able to follow through their reasoning, follow through their logic. Mm-hmm. If you cannot answer the question of what a percentage is, you will not be able to understand how to do it, except in a very rudimentary way that you will want to delegate to a computer as quickly as possible, because it doesn't make any sense. It's just some kind of abstract formula. Whereas if you actually understand what a percentage is, then even if you can't remember the specific formula, you at least know what you're trying to do. You're trying to say, well, if I had 100 of these things, how many of them would be this thing? And that level of knowledge tends to answer the question sufficiently well that you can then work out what the formula is for yourself. And where you can't, then you ask ChatGPT to help you or whatever else it is. What I'm worried about is that we're not asking that basic question. Why do we want a percentage? Why does the boss want a percentage? Why are we doing it this way at all? Do we still need to do it this way? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be wrestling with before we can decide what is the best tool to give us the result that we want. We have to have an idea.
So, but I'm interested in that. Maybe fireworks are going off in my head. I can think of 1,000 things that I'd like to sort of pursue, because I think this is really interesting. But let's pick a couple and choose one. The first is, I think this is a really interesting conversation, but realistically, it's a philosophical conversation between two guys who've grown up in the world, and they are reflecting on the past and the future and making all sorts of value judgments. Let's be honest, the younger generation are not even thinking about this. And so there may be a dilemma where we sit there and pontificate, but in the meantime, the next generation is just wholly acceptant, not critical thinking at all. They just embrace it because it's there, in the same way that we may have once marveled at an iPad. Okay, a toddler won't give it a second glance. They'll just go, yep, and totally acceptant. So I'm quite interested in the extent to which any critical thinking is completely bypassed by a different generation. I think that's very relevant. And I also, to your point also about effectively dashboards, I also worry that we're in a world full of dashboards, but not substance. We've got so many dials and flashing alarms and interesting eye candy and 3-point plans and microwave menus that we don't do substance anymore. And I suppose both of those are linked to critical thinking. And at the risk of playing with racial stereotypes, okay, which is always dangerous, there is a perception that, for example, the education system is different in Southeast Asia to that which it is in Western countries. And therefore, the education system, the value system, the way we approach problems are different. And I'm wondering what effect that has in a world where AI tries to treat all of those things the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think what you just nailed, the biggest danger of AI is that it homogenizes us. And at the moment, it will homogenize us into one of two camps. Because I know, the big AI companies, they are working with other languages, particularly so that we can translate from and into. And some smaller projects are trying to use the models that are available and train them on sort of more locally specific kind of data sets so that the tools are more productive. But fundamentally, 80%, if we're using Pareto's law, 80% of the AI is being developed in West Coast America or in China. And that means it is being developed either by Mandarin Chinese speakers or young West Coast American English speakers. And that makes a huge, huge difference because our thought processes are fundamentally shaped by the language in which that we use. So the way that we train the AI and what the AI is able to do and what the AI is able to present to us, and consequently the way in which we are shaped by the AI, is shaped by the large language model underneath it. And if the large language model is primarily trained on English or on Chinese, you're going to get significantly different results. And the key to making sure that we don't all become sort of carbon copies of each other is to push back against that and to use the tools in order to deliberately go looking for alternative lenses. So let me just put that particular thought. I think we'll come back to that. But let me just give you two examples. I'm thinking of education in Chinese societies, of which Singapore is still Chinese dominated, and so there's a lot around this. It is an oversimplification, but I think there is value and truth in saying that a Chinese style, traditional style of education is far more based on rote learning than what we are now used to in the West. And no big secret to that. And there has been some argument made, not unconvincingly, that the tendency for East Asians to be better at mathematics is in no small part to that rote learning, which is quite an interesting thing in and of itself. But with that kind of background in my mind, I went into a maths classroom in a Chinese school, and all of the children's 30 primary school children sitting in a classroom, they all had the same kit in front of them, which included a box of sort of counting aids that we're familiar with in our own schools. They included little sticks that the kids could use to help count and make groups and so on. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I have only ever seen this in a Chinese context. The teacher asked the students to get out 12 sticks. All these 30 students got out 12 sticks. And then she went round every single student, 30 students, one by one, and she asked every single student to explain how they knew that they had 12 sticks on the table. And one said, well, I counted them out one by one. I said, okay, and how did you do it? Well, I took them out two by two, and when I'd done it 6 times, I knew I'd got 12. And how did you do it? Well, I laid them out in threes, and when I'd got 4 rows, I knew I had 12. This kind of thing went all the way around the classroom until she had exhausted as best she could all of the different ways that you could know that there were 12 items on the table in front of you. That was the lesson. What I think we're used to in supposedly the free thinking, higher level, no, we don't need rote learning, we can work it all out. I think it would be far more usual for us to experience something where the teacher says, right, take out 12 sticks. Okay, you've all got 12. Great. This is what we're going to do with them. So the lesson is what we're going to do with the 12 sticks. The lesson is not, do you know there's more than one way to know that you've got 12 sticks? That is a little indication that culture, in my mind, is far less about, what kind of dress and what kind of music and, what kind of food, which is the things that we normally focus on. And it's much more about how we look at the world. And in a world where there is a tendency, because we are using the same tools, to become more and more homogenized, it is incumbent upon us to push ourselves to say, is there another way to know that I've got 12 sticks? Or is there another way of expressing this? So my second point related to that, if I can give you an illustration, I taught French before I was teaching Chinese. I don't think I ever taught numbers to a group of students without having to get to the point where, well, we get to 60 and then we don't have any numbers after that. We have to say, 70 is 60 plus 10 and 80 is 4 lots of 20 and then 90 is 4 lots of 20 plus another 10. I don't think I ever got through that lesson that I had to do goodness knows how many times without at least several students in the class saying, that's stupid. The instinctive reaction is, it's just wrong. It's illogical. It doesn't make any sense. When you look at numbers, they break down into hundreds. Everybody knows that. It's common human knowledge. I say, really? Well, for those of you that have an analog watch, right? What time is it? How many minutes are there in an hour? How many seconds are there in a minute? How many degrees are there in a circle? How helpful is 100 when you're dealing with circles? Oh, no. That's different. That's different. Obviously, we work with 60s then. Well, why is that obvious? Right. So the point is, if you want to be operating with circles, 60 is a much better base than 100. If you want to be working with squares, 100 is a much better base than 60. It's a question of, do we want to be working with squares or do we want to be working with circles? And then we choose the appropriate thought mechanism, the appropriate thinking framework, and only then do we then choose what the appropriate tool is to help us to establish the job.
Now, the reason
So it's that process.
Absolutely fascinating, and it's one of those sort of light bulb moments when somebody tells you something you already know, but then you suddenly see it through a new lens. You'd never considered it before, because of course I recognize the 6 minutes and an hour, and the majority of the world weren't decimalized running after the French Revolution.
Right.
But to see it that way is really interesting. And the reason I mention the French Revolution is because actually communication and language is also a function of history.
Yeah.
And the fact that the French did decide to decimalize things, including at one stage how many days there are in a year, which they obviously subsequently abandoned. But I imagine that if your history is different, then your language will be different. And you've already talked about how language informs how we perceive the world. And if we were going to be silly about this, if your entire large language model, the only thing you've ever read was the works of Shakespeare, or indeed, the history of Russia, it would have completely different views of the world, not just as a function of language, but also it's making assumptions based on context.
Yeah.
Philosophically, this is the difference between what is and what ought to be. If I see loads of men in high-powered professional jobs over the last century, we might assume that that is actually what's supposed to happen. So we say this is the case in the past, therefore it ought to be the case in the future. And of course, therein we have all sorts of rash assumptions, because actually the past should not be a predictor of the future, whether it's in terms of gender, race, equality, diversity. And so we have these large language models that may well be problematic, not just from language, but because language is a function of history.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And so one of the things that I'm particularly excited about with AI is that it allows us to say, how would you say this in another language? And see whether that sheds a different light on it. Because if you like, the the collective wisdom of the years that has been compiled in that language may actually encapsulate certain things that weren't encapsulated in, the collective annals written in another language, for precisely the reason you just gave. The context is different, the history is different, the background's different, and so consequently, the things that people have focused on and that people have paid attention to are different, and that cannot help but be encapsulated in the language, because words draw on analogy. And so how you explain something by reference to something else will vary from language to language, precisely because the historical background, which provides the common reference that people will understand your analogy, is different. I mean, in America, that you have the elephants and the donkeys, right? You say donkey in the Channel Islands, it doesn't mean an American political party. If you talk about elephants in Thailand, they're also not thinking about so even when you have a word for the same thing, what it represents is not necessarily the same thing. So one illustration that I think is quite easy for us to get our heads around. I don't know if you remember in the credit crunch, David Cameron went to China, effectively saying, our economy is a bit up the chute. We could really do with some Chinese investment into Britain. Without wanting to abase himself too much, he effectively was going with a begging bowl. He was daft enough to schedule that very, very important and sensitive meeting for November. So he turned up in China wearing a poppy for Remembrance Day. Well, a poppy to a Brit means remembrance of people who have made the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of other people. That's an incredibly humbling thing. It's an incredibly precious symbol because of what it represents. What it means to the Chinese is the Brits didn't like the Chinese trying to stop their highly profitable opium trade in the South, and so waged war against China, which China lost, which Britain knew they would, as a result of which Britain took an enormous amount of silver, took Hong Kong for 100 years, took 5 other ports for many, many years, and effectively brought China to its knees until, well, some would say until 1949, other people would say until 1980. And China is still trying to get over the emotional trauma of that. And all of China's personal humiliation is represented by the poppy. So when somebody turns up saying, please, can we have some of your money, flashing a poppy, that triggers all kinds of emotions and feelings based on history and experience and common reference in the Chinese, which are completely at odds with what's going on in the mind of the person that's wearing the poppy. So that's an illustration of how even the same object can have a range of different connotations, and our mistake that we so easily use with and AI and digital translation makes it worse. It's like, so does this, whatever that word is, does it mean poppy? Yes, it does, says AI, quite correctly. Oh, well, that's it then. No, that's the beginning. The next question is, what does a poppy mean to this person and what does it mean to that person? Is that the same thing? And what we know about human beings is very rarely does the same thing mean the same thing to both parties. I mean, even the two of us, if we took something perhaps innocuous like golf, we may well feel, I mean, I would be astonished if we did not feel differently to one another about golf, even if we both like golf. You probably like it more than I do. Maybe you went somewhere that I haven't been. You've played courses that I haven't, and so on. So when we say golf, even when we're in the same culture, in the same language, human beings have very different set of emotions and connotations associated with the same label.
I think this
And
is
that,
really, I think this is really interesting for multiple reasons. I think the first one that it occurs to me, again, relatively obvious, but it's a fresh perspective, is the idea that data is global, but meaning is local.
nice. Absolutely.
And what's really interesting and challenging about that is increasingly we are in a world where organizations are trying to attract people, either employees or customers, on this sense of meaning and purpose. But if every single person joins the organization with with a localized version of what that meaning and purpose is, I mean, there may not just be variance, there may be actually outright conflict. And of course, to a certain extent, we will see that in politics. You know, the whole world is going to the polls. Recently, Britain has, France is going through the process, America is about to. And of course, we are all facing the same challenges, but politically, different parties, different groups will have entirely different ways of addressing them. And I think
Absolutely.
this is the interesting thing about meaning and purpose. The data is the same, but what we choose to see, how we choose to interpret it, how we see ourselves and others as good, bad, indifferent, bystanders, empowered, it's messy, and yet it's messy in a world where increasingly we're driving for some form of consensus, and that consensus forces us into echo chambers. And so it's just a really weird mix. And I'm really interested, therefore, in, for example, a culture like Singapore, where actually you have all sorts of cultural backgrounds, language backgrounds, education backgrounds. It really is possibly more than anywhere else a massive melting pot. And I'm wondering
Mm-hmm.
how that works there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting point. Singapore is very unusual in the way it operates and in the way that it's been trying to do things. I think it's worth noting that Singapore is really it's a tiny place, and it is not in the middle, but it is an integral part of Malaysia, in the same way that you could say that. In fact, more so than you could say that Jersey really is an integral part of Normandy,
Mhm.
sort of geographically and culturally and historically. That's where it sits.
Mhm.
So then you start to say, well, so why is Jersey not French, and why is Singapore, not Malaysian? Well, in the case of Singapore, it was Malaysian until 1965, and the reason it became independent is not because that Singaporeans suddenly decided that they didn't want to be part of Malaysia anymore, but because Singapore had a much more diverse racial makeup than other parts of Malaysia. And in the rest of the Malaysian Federation, the national laws were constructed for the benefit of ethnic Malays.
Mhm.
Well, in Singapore, where you had a large proportion of people who were ethnically Chinese or Indian, and a sizable smattering of people from other nations as well, they just could not be second-class citizens in their own homeland.
Mm.
And so at that point, they said, well, we cannot accept the laws of the Malaysian Federation because that's what would happen. And so they were ejected, and
Mm.
they then had to try and build an identity of their own, which hadn't been the original plan at all. But because of the reason that they were ejected, they were then especially sensitive to the need to ensure that everybody, whatever their ethnicity, had equal access to housing, had equal access to education, had equal access to this, that, and the other. It is also, at the risk of, oversimplification and stereotypes again, it is an Asian society, and perhaps, it's a different stage of history and a different way of thinking about social cohesion versus individual responsibility. And so it was able to effectively manage a society much more actively than perhaps would be possible for us to do in the UK, for example. But they took it very, very seriously, and they took seriously the need to protect and to look after the different ethnic groups. From an outsider's perspective, it can look a little bit hokey sometimes. Whenever there is a poster about some kind of event in Singapore, there's always at least four faces. You've got to have the four biggest, ethnic groups. You've got to have a face from each represented in the poster. And yeah, it can be a bit over the top sometimes, but it shows the care with which the place has tried to make sure that everybody feels like they are Singaporean, not just Indian or Chinese or whatever else. And I think that has worked out much better than, the typical ghettoized situations that we see in the United States, for example, and so where there really is very little cross-pollination, if you like, between the different communities that come from different backgrounds and so on. There's not that Singapore doesn't have any issues that way, but it is much more like that. But one of the things that I think is interesting in Singapore's case, because it's small, like Jersey, it's considerably bigger than Jersey, but still it compared to its neighbors, it's small. You have to work together somehow. It's no good saying, oh, well, we're going to break away. It forces you to actually work out some of those differences. And that means, for example, in an office, because most people who are ethnically Malay by default would consider themselves to be Muslims, and therefore they would not eat pork. It is perfectly normal in an office where there may be very few Malays actually on the staff. But if there are any Malays at all, there is a microwave which is reserved for food without any pork lard in, and another microwave for whatever else you want to put into it. That level of thinking about the needs of somebody that perhaps looks at food and diet differently to you, I find it hard to find that at a social level in other parts of the world. You might find it on an individual level, but doesn't tend to be on a societal level. And this, I think, leads back, if I can sort of bring it full circle to language again. This, to me, is what AI gives us an exciting opportunity to do with language. Up until now, we've assumed that the purpose of learning French is so that we non-French people can then go and talk to French people. And we can, if we remember our school days French, we can tell them to fill our car up with 4-star petrol, and we can book a campsite, and we can tell those French people that don't understand English what we want. So it's constantly still looking at the world through our perspective, but working out how to put that into some kind of French code that they will understand. And the same thing happens the other way with EAL programs. When you have kids that come over from Madeira to Jersey and they need to try and fit into an English language system, then the provision is there to try and help them to operate in an English language system. And yes, we may well, thankfully, the Jersey language program is excellent, and trying to make sure that in that process they don't lose their Portuguese heritage. But nonetheless, the purpose of the language program is to get them to talk to us. It's all about the them and us. Mm-hmm. What I think in the days of AI is that is no longer relevant. Because if I want to make myself understood to a French person or a Brazilian or a Chinese or a Japanese. I don't have to learn a word of their language. I speak into Google and it speaks it back out exactly what I said instantly. So in terms of that sort of me communicating to you and even you communicating to me, AI translation makes it pointless me learning a foreign language simply so that I can communicate with them. So is there any point to learning another language in the AI age, given that we have these incredible translation tools available now? I think, yes, there is. But the reason for me to learn French is not so that I can speak to French people. It's so that I, as an English speaker, can look at my world and my environment through a different lens based on the collective wisdom of hundreds of years of French people building up analogies and connections and so on. And what AI allows me to do is now, unlike going through one school language program where I may learn one language, possibly two, through my whole school career, now with AI, I can get 100 different language lenses on the same situation in an instant. And I'll give you sort of two brief examples of what I mean by that. 2008, to take it back to the Cameron example, how much ink was spilt over the credit crisis or the credit crunch or whatever name we wanted to give it. And hours and hours of chatting about where it came from and what it meant and all the rest of it. What I find I do is if I'm struggling to get my head around it, and people obviously found it very difficult to understand, that's why there was so much talking around it, I go to another language. So in this case, I looked at, well, what's the Chinese word for credit? And I looked at, actually it's a Chinese character, and it's pictographic, and it shows a person on one side, and on the other side, it shows words. So it's a person standing by their word. So it could be the words from a person, a message, or it could be a person bringing words, as in a messenger, or it could be a person that is trustworthy because they stand by their word, or it could be the act of me putting trust in that person because they are trustworthy, because they stand by their word. And of course, in English, we have words like trust, credit, belief, faith, allegiance. They're all actually interrelated if you take it back etymologically. But the connection between all of those different dimensions is lost because we've given them different labels in modern English. In Chinese, they've kept the same label. So those connections are still alive. The credit crunch basically comes down to the bank does not trust that I will pay them back if they lend me the money. That's it. And why don't they trust? Because they don't know me. We have no relationship with each other. They've never spoken to me. That's the words and the person again. So where we started to see things changing, like in Germany, there was a rise in sort of more local banking, precisely because business leaders would say, my banker knows me like my GP knows me. And then we can start to come out of this. That insight and that possibility that this might be an avenue worth exploring came simply when I said, how do you say credit in Chinese? Oh, it's a person next to a word. What does that mean? So just like the example that I gave you with, if we feel instinctively that's stupid, that is a warning, or somebody's got angry where I didn't expect them to. That is a sign that we're looking at things from a different perspective. So let me try and see what your perspective is, because it makes me a bigger, more effective problem solver, business solution finder in my context. It's not just so that I can order a meal when I go to France on holiday. It's so that when I've got no French people around me at all, I am more effective in my current role. So one final example of the same thing, the periodic table. I gave up chemistry after, when I was 16. I never really got my head around it. I knew the first couple of rows and I sort of knew what that was. And I had some vague idea what the numbers, but I had no idea why is it that shape? Why is that bit missing? And what's all that stuff done? No idea. Now, I've been privileged to have high levels of education, postgraduate education, all the rest of it. I still today would struggle to tell you anything really very intelligent about the periodic table until relatively recently. I thought, I wonder what the periodic table looks like in Chinese. Now, you think your average school student and your average teacher and your average parent is going to go, mate, you don't understand chemistry. You're struggling with your French. You do not want to be looking at the periodic table in Chinese. But what I've found is when you look at the periodic table in Chinese, because of the way that Chinese expresses itself differently, with no understanding of Chinese at all, anybody with a little bit of looking at that for patterns can very quickly find that there are a lot of boxes that have this particular symbol, and then a few boxes that have this symbol, and there are two boxes that have that symbol, and then there are another few boxes that have that symbol. And within 2 minutes, your average primary school kid with no understanding of Chinese would say, Sir, Miss, there seem to be 4 kinds of box on this table. One's got this in it, one's got that in it, that's got that, and that's that. At which point the teacher can say, well, yes, that bit means metal, that bit means stone, that bit means gas, and that bit means liquid. So what do you think that means now? Well, I think that means all of these are metals, all of these are gases, all of these are some kind of stone or mineral, and these are some kind of a liquid. Yes, they are. That 2-minute lesson, which I discovered by looking at the periodic table in Chinese when I was in my late 40s, suddenly helped me understand the building blocks of the world in which I'd lived for nearly half a century better than I had ever done before. And it happened purely and simply because I changed the language lens that I was using to look at the same thing.
This has been absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I've learnt a lot. Um, I've seen old things through new lenses, which I've really valued. There is an area that I'd like to explore, but actually, I'd like to invite you back to another podcast because I think it'll open up a whole new conversation. But I'm really interested in, if you'd be up for another podcast, how all this relates to our belonging. I think it's
Mm,
Theresa May who said, we are citizens of nowhere. I think you make a point much earlier in the podcast about the relationship between the student and the lecturer or tutor or
mm,
teacher. And that's clearly very localized.
mm,
But we're in a global world. We talk about
mm,
local banking, but
mm,
there are global issues.
mm,
And I think exploring Singapore's culture, history, and politics is really interesting in terms of who do you belong to? And of course, in Britain, they, to a certain extent, had an element of that conversation with the Brexit vote. You know, who do we identify with? Do we identify as being European or British? And are they completely different things on Venn diagram? Is there no way that they could overlap? And of
right.
course, you know, we're both from Jersey, so of course, you know, we have nothing whatsoever to do with those people in Guernsey, our sister island, unless, of course, we're met with an American, in which case we and the Guernsey folk are very, very close neighbours, and we just don't get on
Absolutely.
with the American. But of course, if somebody else comes from somewhere else, maybe we'd be Westerners and have a completely different view of that other
Mm,
culture. And I think this local meaning, local language, global context, I think is really interesting. And it's a conversation I'd like to pursue further with you because I love your insights, which without doubt are informed by a different perspective being somewhere else. And I find that tremendously valuable.
mm. I'd love to do that. That sounds like a fascinating conversation.